G'day, welcome to this ADF Mobile Insider presentation. My name's Chris Muir, I'm an ADF Product Manager for Oracle Corporation. Contrary to many opinions over the last few years, email has not died a death and is still really much a predominant part of many of our lives. This is particularly true in the enterprise space where personally I still receive on maybe 50 emails each day that I need to read and respond to. As email is still very much a large part of our lives, but so are devices like this now, iPhones, Android phones, tablets. It's very important for mobile application developers that they integrate email services seamlessly into their applications. From my personal experience, if an application doesn't integrate well with email, I'm unlikely to use it. In this ADF Mobile presentation today, I'd like to teach you how to integrate email into your ADF Mobile applications to ensure the success of your mobile application development. As such, what we'll cover in this in-depth presentation today is the three different ways you can call your mobile device email services, that being through the data control palette, the Java APIs, or the JavaScript APIs. We'll also consider some extensions to the solutions which developers might like to pursue to make a more rounded and user-friendly solution, as well as concepts such as attaching files to emails. Finally, we'll discuss some of the limitations you will hit predominantly with the iOS simulator and Android emulator, and what this means to you as a developer. Before we undertake this deep dive into email services, I need to highlight the fact that this presentation was published with ADF Mobile version 1, which was the current release, specifically for JDeveloper 11.1.2.3.0. By the time you view this presentation, there may be later releases of ADF Mobile that may have resulted in changes to some of the content that I'm going to discuss today, in particular the APIs. Please take time to consult the latest ADF Mobile documentation via the bit.ly link to ensure that you have the latest information at hand. So talking about returning to the content at hand, first let's cover off the overall architecture picture of how ADF Mobile integrates with the device services, such as email, SMS, the camera, and so on your device. This picture shows the common architecture diagram from ADF Mobile, and specifically in red, the overall JVM container that ADF Mobile runs in on your iOS or Android device. In order for the ADF Mobile application to connect and communicate with the device services, ADF Mobile makes use of PhoneGap, highlighted here in blue, which provides those services. PhoneGap, also known as Apache Cordova, provides the APIs under the covers that ADF makes use of to access your phone or tablet services, such as email, SMS, camera, the GPS, and the contact services. It's worthwhile noting, though, ADF Mobile abstracts away from the underlying PhoneGap solution and wraps ADF APIs around these PhoneGap services. So underneath it is indeed PhoneGap that is used, but to you it looks like normal ADF solutions. As such, not only is Oracle documentation a valid place to look up information on these services, so is the PhoneGap or Cordova documentation. In particular, this external documentation includes useful information on the capabilities and limitations of the different devices, that being iOS and Android, that you're likely to deploy to and have to deal with. Overall, ADF Mobile through PhoneGap provides a wide range of services you can make use of in your phone or tablets applications, such as email that we're going to discuss today. In addition, ADF Mobile provides multiple different mechanisms for developers to make use of those facilities, some which are available for all services, some are limited to particular mechanisms only. Of those mechanisms, there is essentially 4 that you can make use of. The first is the data control palette, which is one of the main productivity boosters of the JDeveloper IDE. Through a device data control and associated methods, this allows developers to literally drag and drop the associated device service, such as email, onto an ADF Mobile AMX page, and JDeveloper will wire up the page and components such that there is little programming required on the developer's part. The second mechanism is EL, or expression language. Through EL, an explicit device scope object is available to allow developers to query the device services. For example, for email services, it might be useful to enable or disable an email button based on the current network status via the expression #device_scope.device.network status. This returns a number of different values to give you an idea of the network status, Is the device currently connected to a 3G network or Wi-Fi? And you could enable and disable the button as a result. Alternatively to these mechanisms, if the developer wants more control over the service integration, via a Java managed bean in the AMX pages, there is also a Java API that provides programmatic access to these services. As you can see in this brief example, the Device Manager singleton accessed via the Device Manager Factory provides a send email method. Finally, if you decide to create local HTML pages in your ADF mobile application over AMX pages, there is also a JavaScript API available to you for sending emails to. With all that in mind, let me now demonstrate how to build an ADF mobile application that integrates email through the data control palette in an AMX page. Okay, what we have in front of us here is JDeveloper 11.1230. Now, in the application navigator on the left-hand side, I've already created an ADF mobile application called Email Demo. And within that, I've already created a feature file where you can see I have a feature called Send Email comprised of a single AMX page called Send Email via Data Control. And that page is already open and we can see it here. And the page at the moment has virtually nothing much in it. You can see a panel page, the header facet, and an output text control simply with the value email, and the resulting page on the right hand side. Now what I'd like to do is include the actual send email facilities from the data control palette. And you can see that I already have this open down on the left hand side. It has a data control called device features, which underneath has a number of different methods which can provide access to the different device features on your device. Obviously the one we're interested in today is the send email method, and you might notice that it has a number of parameters. Those parameters can be seen here once we expand the node, and we can see that we've got parameters for to, CC, subject, body, and so on and so forth. Now the real productivity booster in the JDeveloper IDE is, in order to call that particular method, I can just simply drag and drop it onto the page, where I get a number of options for the UI components that I might want to generate in order to call this facility. Now I could just create a send email button which will invoke the email facilities on the device, or alternatively we can get a screen with a little bit more control or facilities for the user called the ADF Mobile Parameter Form. In selecting that option, we can see here that what it will do for us is wire up a page with a number of input text controls that actually map to the different parameters of the send email method that we can see via the data control palette. Now for this particular demo, I don't want to get into all the types of features that we need to deal with for emails, so I'm going to delete a couple of these fields. Clicking OK, the end result is you can see on the right hand side I now have a page for the different fields, a button, and that's all reflected on the left hand side here in the code, where we can see a number of different input text controls mapping to the to field, the CC field, the subject and the body, and in addition a command button that will actually send the email for us. The EL expressions here are effectively mapping or binding to the file behind the scenes, the page.def file for the relating page, and essentially these are all the bindings or the mappings that relate back to the data control and the send email method. To prove that, if I double click on the send email method here, the edit, device features, send email, you can see that this is very much the same from the data control palette, plus all the parameters that are required to access that specific method. Now that we've created the page with all the wired components, what I'd like to demonstrate to you is how this facility works on the actual devices. And I'm going to do that, I should say, by looking at the iOS simulator and the Android emulator. Now, via the magic of recording, I've already done the deployment, so let's go and have a look at them and the actual applications that are already deployed. First thing we'll do is look at the iOS simulator, where I have the email demo application deployed already. On opening that application, we see our AMX page rendered with the individual parameter fields that we're interested in. From there, we can actually enter the information that we want to include for our email. And as a last result, we can click on the Send Email button. An important point there too, you straight away notice is, at least on the iOS devices, when you invoke the email facility, it then must also go through the iPhone's own email facilities. So the fields we provided before allow the user to pre-populate the data, but iOS says that in order to send an email, you must use its own services. So here we've pre-populated data, but the user's really got a two-trigger action that they've got to do. When we look at the Java APIs, you'll find that we can pre-populate all this data without having to go through our own parameter form beforehand. So this will create a more seamless email experience for the user. However, for creating very quickly an email facility in your application, the data control palette provides what we need here. If we in turn go and have a look at the Android simulator, once the application starts, again, just like we saw previously, you'll see that it attempts to make use of the Android emulator's email facilities. However, in the case of the Android emulator, while they're trying to call that, one of the things about Android devices is it requires an email account to be set up as part of the normal settings on the device. So in this case, well, it's not going to be able to get any further in terms of actually testing the actual email facilities. But in reality, it's pretty much the same mechanism. Now in this presentation, what we'd like to do is look at wiring up the email services rather than through the data control palette, actually calling them via a Java bean, or in fact the Java APIs that ADF Mobile also provides. So in returning to JDeveloper 11.1230, what I've already done in the email demo application within the feature file is created a new feature called Send Email by Java. It contains a single AMX page called Send Email by Java, and we can see that it exists here, where I've already dropped a command button onto the page. You can see the result on the right hand side, and this button is going to invoke the Java APIs for actually sending emails programmatically. Now what I want to do is wire up a POJO or a managed bean in order to call the Java APIs when the user clicks on the button. In fact, when the user taps on the button on the mobile device. In order to do that, the very quick way to do that in JDeveloper is to select the command button, then within the property inspector go to the behaviors option, and for the action listener, clicking on the little button here, clicking edit, I now have the ability to quickly create a bean of view scope in this particular application example, and the method that we're going to call is called action send email. As a result, you can now see the action listener for the command button called viewscope mybean action send email. Mybean is hardwired into the ADFC mobile config file. So essentially you now have a managed bean. The dialog before has done all these configurations for you. And finally, on the left hand side, we have mybean, which has the method that will be called when the user taps on the button. So before we actually look at some Java API examples, let's just look at the Java API itself for sending emails. The send email method is provided through the oracle.adf.model.datacontrollers.device.deviceManager class. The send email method itself has a number of parameters that it takes, which includes to, CC, subject body, BC attachments, and MIME types. Now, given that we're pretty much familiar with emails, I don't think I need to go through any of these, but to say with the email fields or recipient lists such as to, CC, and BCC, if you need to include multiple email addresses in there, essentially make them comma delimited. In addition, there is a requirement that any of the email addresses that you enter actually are valid email addresses. Otherwise, the facility will not invoke the actual email services on the device. For adding attachments to an email, such as if you've taken a picture with the getPicture data control service and it's been written down to the file system of the device, in order to add that picture to the email, what you do in the attachment section is, in a comma delimited format again, is you provide the full path to that picture or the alternative files that you want to send along with the email. Those paths, the actual path of the device where the image or the files are stored, is actually returned by the other methods, so you would need to store that actual result and then pass it along to the email API here. You would also notice that in turn for sending attachments that you have an option called MIME types, and essentially this is where you will specify the type of file that you're attaching and sending out via the email. Again, comma delimited if you're doing a number of different file types. It is possible to leave this field null, and that will essentially allow ADF Mobile to try and determine the file type on your behalf. Given that we've seen the API examples, now let's actually look at a real example of using this API in order to send an email out. Returning to our myBean example that we just hardwired in the manage beans and the action send email method, we can see that the very first thing we need to do is get access to the device manager singleton provided by the device manager factory.getDeviceManager method. Then for the actual email that we're going to send out, we need to set up all our fields. So in this example, I've just set up a number of strings to hold on line 7 the people we're going to send the email directly to, the CC copies on line 8, the actual subject on line 9, and the body on line 10. Finally, on line 12, once we've got all those together, including the device manager object, we can simply call, in this example, device.sendEmail, passing in all those fields. And now this will invoke the email facilities on the device. Because we're doing this programmatically, we will not have to go through a parameter form to enter all this data. Essentially, once the user taps on the button, we'll go straight to the device's email services. In the final demonstration of this presentation, rather than looking using the data control palette or the Java APIs embedded within an AMX page, what I'd like to show you is how to call the JavaScript APIs if you instead decide to use a local HTML page embedded in your ADF Mobile application. Again, returning to JDeveloper 11.1230, in the features file of the email demo application, I've added a new feature called Send Email by JavaScript. Now, a key difference this time is we're not using an AMX page, we're using a local HTML page called Send Email by JavaScript. If we look at the basic page at the moment, there's not much content in it. So what we have in front of us here is a JavaScript example for sending emails. One of the very first things we need to deal with is importing the JavaScript libraries that will give us access to the send email function in JavaScript. As you can see, there is 4 libraries: PhoneGap, ADF.el, jQuery, and ADF MF device integration. The relative path of these particular files is to that of the public HTML directory of your application. So in the particular examples that I'm showing you at the moment, because this HTML page is going in a subdirectory, I need to go back 4 directories in order to access these particular JavaScript files in the source attribute of the script tag. Within the content of the body of the page, we've included a button called Send Email. You'll notice on click inside that actual button, it calls the Send Email method, which I've defined above as a JavaScript function, and inside that it essentially calls adf.mf.api.sendEmail to send an email out to Joe Doe in this particular example. So let's have a look at this code actually running in, for example, the iOS simulator. So pretty much I've copy and pasted the code you just saw in the PowerPoints. If I go to the iOS simulator where I've already deployed the application, you can see in the particular feature for the local HTML page my big send email button, and when I click on it you can now see the actual email facilities of the iOS simulator open to joedoe.oracle.com test, which ultimately are reflected in the JavaScript API that we just sent or called. Now that we've looked at demonstrating the different ways to actually call or make use of the email facilities on your device, let's talk about some extensions that developers might like to include in their applications to make the overall email facility more user-friendly. In terms of the device manager singleton that provides access to the underlying services, it does provide 2 handy methods that might be useful for send emails. The first one is .getNetworkStatus, which returns a number of different enumerated types, essentially telling you if the current device is connected to, say, a 3G network or Wi-Fi or something similar. This is useful before sending out an email because there's no point sending the email unless you're connected. So you can add appropriate error messages or hide the appropriate content on the screen if the device is currently not connected to a network. In addition, because email is so reliant on email addresses in order to send the emails out, rather than having the user type the email addresses in, you can actually use the device manager.findContacts method to explore the contacts in the user's address book on the device to retrieve email addresses on their behalf. So this might save them some unnecessary typing and ultimately some unnecessary emails sent out that are bounced back because the email address is wrong when they typed it in. Finally, one other thing you might want to do is wrap your calls to send email in an exception handler. And the ADF framework, ADF Mobile framework I should say, does provide a custom exception, oracle.adf mf framework exception, ADF exception, that you can wrap around your Java APIs in order to catch any particular errors occurring with that service. We previously did also talk somewhat about the attachments facility in order to attach files to the outgoing emails. This is dictated by the attachments and MIME type parameters on the send email method. Both parameters can take multiple files and multiple MIME types as long as they're common delimited, and for the attachments, typically this will be a list of paths to files on the local device. For the MIME types, this is going to differ depending on the types of files you're sending out. So for example, if it's images, it might be JPEGs or PNGs. If it's a PDF document or text documents, you're definitely going to have different MIME types for them. If you don't want to deal with the complexities of the MIME types, you can actually leave that parameter null and ADF Mobile will attempt to decide for you. But it's not going to know all the file types that you're attempting to send out, so maybe from a defensive programming point of view, you really should record this somewhere and then add it to the method so nothing goes wrong. In terms of retrieving files, well, the way that the different platforms deals with files is significantly different, and it has to do with a different philosophy of how the devices are put together. We know with Android it's pretty much an open environment where applications can share files amongst the file system and the SD cards on the device. So the path that you can actually supply to the attachments on send email can pretty much be any file on the device. With iOS, because of its restricted nature, at the moment, at least in iOS 6, there's not a lot of ability to share files between the different applications. So the path in this case is normally relative to that of the application itself. So you will have had to install pictures in the application's file path or files previously, and those are what you're going to send out via email. Specifically for iOS then, that means either you've made use of the getPicture device manager function, or you've retrieved files externally via a REST service adapter. In concluding the presentation, finally, let's just talk about some limitations you will hit. One of the things that you saw earlier on, and is slightly clunky about the way that the devices themselves provide email services, is that you programmatically or through the data control palette can't automatically send an email out. You need to go through the device's actual email screen to do that. In the case of the data control palette then, with the parameter form, this makes it very clunky for the user because it feels like a two-stage process, where essentially editing and filling out all the parameters in our form, then invoking the the email service I should say, and then verifying what we just entered, then sending it out. It would seem to me that potentially what you really want to do is remove that parameter form, maybe programmatically generate some of the data, but then call the email facilities directly and allow the user to enter the data there, such that it isn't a two-step process. Something else we saw that was a limitation, but not a limitation to your application deployed to a real device, is the fact that the iOS simulator and the Android emulator, while they do allow your application to invoke the send email facilities in the application, they can't actually allow you to send the email in the end. They won't actually go out from the device. And this kind of makes sense because these devices, at least from the simulator and emulator perspective, aren't really registered to anyone. So they're not real applications as such and real devices, so no email will go out. That brings up the point that if you want to do full testing, and this is something that the mobile developers always recommend to you, do not just rely on the simulator and emulator for testing your applications. You must test these applications on real devices to make sure that they work. So in conclusion to the presentation, we see that ADF Mobile gives you access to a number of the device features such as email, SMS, the GPS, and so on and so forth through the PhoneGap APIs, which are soon to be called Apache Cordova. To make this a more productive programming environment, ADF and particularly the JDeveloper provides the data control palette for calling these services and wiring up your pages particularly quickly. But Oracle also provides a number of APIs that wrap the PhoneGap APIs in order to allow you to call out to these services from your Java beans, your managed beans, your JavaScript pages, and so on. In terms of actually making use of these features and testing these features, it's highly recommended that you just don't test them on the simulators and emulators, but you also get the real devices, a real Android phone, a real iPhone, a real iPad, and make sure that when you're calling out to features like SMS and email and GPS and so on and so forth, that this really does work. There's nothing like testing in the real environment to make sure your applications will work correctly. For your reference, there's more information available about accessing the device features in ADF Mobile via the ADF Mobile Developer Guide 11.1230 in section 9.5. Follow the bit.ly link here. And as I recommended, it's well worth having a look at the PhoneGap and Apache Cordova API documentation for calling these services, because under the covers this is what ADF Mobile actually calls, and the PhoneGap documentation has all sorts of little nuances, particularly about the differences between devices and what features work and what features don't work. So this is a really good source of information. So that concludes this ADF Mobile Insider Essentials presentation. Now, keep an eye out for further presentations we're going to do. So we've looked at integrating email here, but we're also going to release presentations on integrating the camera, the contacts, SMS, the GPS, and so on and so forth. So there's going to be a lot of different individual presentations that you can learn quite comprehensively how to make use of all the device features on, well, ultimately devices like the iPhone. Thanks very much for your time today, and I'll hope to see you in another presentation soon.